All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call to order the Tuesday, January 16th, 2024 Committee of the Whole meeting of Oregon City Council. If you would join me and stand with the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Council. There is no requirement for attendance for a Committee of the Whole meeting. I do want to note all council members are here, several members of the administration. Mrs. Spaloff did reach out to me. She had a conflict in her schedule for this evening and will not be here. First item that we're going to get into this evening, we don't have persons and delegations as part of our agenda this evening. However, we have a citizen that would like to come talk to us a little bit about some of their concerns and experiences with Airbnbs in their neighborhood. So at this time, I would ask Ms. Chris Belli to please come to the podium to say your name and your address for the record, please.
Christopher J. Belli, 2068 Lilas Drive. All set?
Yep, go right ahead.
Mayor, Council, thanks for having me tonight. Already introduced myself. I'm a 19-plus year resident on North Lilas Drive, so the section of Lilas Drive that goes from Bayshore Road to the lake. That street is essentially a single lane street, maybe a lane and a half. There's approximately 12 homes on the street. And like I said, I've lived there since 2004. Within the last maybe 3 to 4 years, there's started to be some properties that are used as short-term rentals. Initially, it was the upstairs of a garage, and the single-family home was the renter. And then that single-family home has since turned into an Airbnb. So now there's actually 2 Airbnbs on one piece of property. And then directly across from my house, there's also an Airbnb. I've found both of them advertised on either Vrbo or the Airbnb website. So it appears that they're, publicly advertised as such. So as recently as the night of the 23rd of December, there was a party at one of the Airbnbs where there were approximately 20 cars on my street. Like I said, it's a 2 single and a half lane street, and the sides are soft. There's no curves, so it doesn't really provide the greatest parking. Plus, especially when it's not frozen or it's not summer, it's kind of turns the street into a mess. I was very concerned with this, but really didn't see any appropriate reason to call the police. I did go down initially when the cars started coming down the street and ask the renter why there were cars parking in the street. And they told me because the Airbnb owner had said that she could only park 2 cars in the street. I did take video just for my own personal record of all of the cars on the street. And in the morning, there were trash and what I believe was vomit on the street in front of the Airbnb. I did notice that I don't necessarily think the owner cleans the place, but he did come over and clean it, but he didn't take any time to actually pick up this trash that was in the street. I ended up doing that. So that was the 23rd of December. On the 2 Saturdays ago, I didn't write the date down. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I was woken by gunfire, what I thought were probably 4 to 5, maybe 6 rapid fire shots of what sounded like a small caliber pistol. It had woken me up, so I wasn't necessarily certain whether I had been dreaming or what was going on there. Plus, we're duck hunters, and there's a lot of duck hunters out there, so I was used to this, hearing it waking me up in the morning and such. So about 5 minutes later, I did notice that the room was lit up, so there was probably a car down the street. I went and looked out the window, observed some people running into a car that was parked in the street, and then I observed 3 or 4 cars leaving. And I did notice that a patrol car had flipped on its lights on Bayshore Road, so I didn't call 911. I stayed up, or I tried to go back to bed, and then I noticed that there were patrol cars down at the end of the street, so I felt like I should get up and at least give a statement to them about it and let them know what I saw. They actually made one arrest. There were ladies in the police cars screaming some not pleasant things. It was just not a good scene. So these are like the most recent and some of the more dramatic things that happen at these Airbnbs. But more so than that, actually, from my perspective, is I just wanted to let the council know that once these things move into your neighborhood, the entire complexion of your neighborhood changes. So ordinarily, you know, a neighbor is accountable for their actions. You can go over and talk to them and say, hey, I don't want this to happen, or this isn't cool, or whatever. And there's usually some way to deal with it. That's not necessarily the case with an Airbnb and the people who come there. A lot of people have this perception, and you know, full disclosure, I've rented Airbnbs before, but they were usually like somebody's ski condo somewhere in a place where it was obvious that these were vacation homes, or even like some sort of a short-term situation where everybody rented their condos out, whatnot. It wasn't, I've never rented a house in somebody's neighborhood. But that being said, it significantly changes the complexion of the neighborhood. For example, when my kids were growing up there, not including my kids, there were 3 kids that lived on the street. There are 3 different families that had kids on the street. The 2 most recent houses that sold turned into Airbnbs. There's no longer any kids on the street. These Airbnbs are at a price point, like I was telling Steve, where they're about the same as going to the Hampton Inn on Navarre Avenue. So I'm not necessarily saying that brings in a bad clientele, but that brings in a completely different atmosphere of what's going on. Like, people have this impression that an Airbnb is, you know, a minivan and the door opens up and some kids pour out and some beach balls and they're going to have fun for the weekend. And that is not the case. So the one that's directly across from my house frequently rents, turns over every day. It's become a popular thing for contractors who come into town to utilize it for 2 or 3 weeks. They bring in their contractor vehicles. So there's F-350, dually, stretch cabs trying to get in and out of a single lane driveway and a single lane street. I've actually had situations where there were 2 of those, large billboarded, you know, Acme Drilling, whatever, and I stared at it for a month. So, and they will frequently be like, call the rest of the crew over for dinner that night. So then the street is filled with contractor vehicles from 6 to 10 p.m. These things are usually noisy. Diesel warming up in the middle of the night or at 4 in the morning, right across the street from my house, usually wakes me up. It's just a completely different thing. And I'm not saying that I could be neighbors with a plumber who had a truck, but this is not the same thing. So as far as my kind of low level beefs, beyond the fact that I lived there for 19 years and there were never shots fired in my street, but now there's gunfire on my street, would be the renters frequently trespass. So they either come down the street, and initially my neighbor, who is a dear friend of mine for 18 years, they were elderly and passed away. That house was up for sale for a while. People would come down the street to look at the lake, and then they'd figure out that that part of the property was empty, and they would trespass their way out into it. Sometimes I would feel like going and saying something. For example, when some people were in broad daylight, two renters were essentially doing everything you could with your clothes on. And I was like, I don't really need to be seeing this. And sometimes I'm just like, you know what, I'm not going to deal with it. Right. And it's not, yeah, I could call the police every time, but I just feel like the police have a lot better things to do than chase down somebody who's just standing there looking at the lake, but it also shouldn't be happening. I had one time a renter, a short-term renter, and his daughter who had brought their kayaks come over to my house because I have easy access to the lake, and they wanted to put their kayaks in use my property to put their kayaks in, and especially in the summer, it gets ridiculously slippery down there. I just don't deal with it because I just don't need people falling, hurting themselves. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but yeah, no. And they literally started arguing with me. And at that point, one of my points I want to make is it shouldn't be my problem, but it is, right? So I guess I could just turn around and walk away from these people, but I frequently am like, why did I even have that conversation? I had that conversation because there's a hotel across the street, which I'm not sure how else you could describe it, right? It is advertised online. It's a nightly thing, and people turn it over every day. Or it can be turned over every day, if you will. There was one time I came, trying to draw a picture of, sometimes I drive down the street and I'm like, okay, what's going on this time? So I come down to pull into my driveway. There's a couple teenagers. You can pretty much tell there's a new family at the rental. There's a couple teenage boys at the end of the street with drones, like these racing drones, and they're literally shooting them out at the lake, turning back around, and they're coming back at my house at like 30 or 40 miles an hour, right over my property. So I go up to them. I'm like, hey, man, like, why is this happening? Why are you like flying that thing over my property? I got into a 5-minute argument with this kid that he has some FAA regulation and I can't tell him he can't fly his drone over my property. Right. So pretty much scare him away with, okay, well, you can tell the police that and they'll get grumpy and go away. But my point again is I just actually wanted to pull into my garage and go do whatever it was I wanted to do that way a day. But I'm talking to the Airbnbers because it's annoying. I talked a little bit about the contractors. The other thing that I notice with the Airbnbs is I know one of the owners, casually, if you will. I don't know the other one at all. But the house gets treated differently than it would if someone lived there. And I'm not necessarily saying that they're not kept up or they're not nice, but because I knew I was coming to this meeting, I generally get annoyed with one of the Airbnbs because he doesn't bring his trash can, right? So their trash can doesn't get pulled in until they have to come clean the place again or something like that. So because I was coming to this meeting, our trash gets picked up on Thursday. I didn't drag the thing back by the garage because I didn't want to look at it, and it's frozen in a puddle right now. It's been sitting out in the street. So, the press piles up. If I don't want to look at litter in the driveway, I go up and just pick the thing up when I pick up mine because I know nobody's coming to look at it. And like I said, there's actually 3 pieces of property that are advertised as being rented. The property directly across from me just got purchased and renovated. It has absolutely no garage or access to a garage. It doesn't have a physical man door with a knob on it. It has sliding glass doors. So if we were in Vegas and I had $100, I'd say I'm going to get another one of these pretty soon. So that's sort of my beefs with it. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Sarah Staboner. I asked her if I could use her name. She works over in the water treatment plant. She lives directly next to the one that has 2 Airbnbs on it. And the reason I ran over and talked to her was because after the shots fired, she had called my neighbor and talked to her a little bit. And my neighbor said, yes, Sarah said she put up her cameras when the Airbnb went. So just think about that, right? So she bought the house from her parents, who's lived there for a long time. And the time she decided to put in cameras was when the Airbnb went, because there is a stranger or strangers in the driveway 10 feet away from her every night, or most nights, if you will. I don't want to exaggerate. I estimate the one directly across from me rents anywhere from 200 to 250 nights a year. Sarah told me a story where she came home and called the police because there were people walking their dogs in her backyard just because it was a grassy backyard. Sometimes these people, it's just, sometimes it's just like, how do you even come up with this? So I would encourage you guys, she was a little shy about it, but I would encourage you guys to maybe touch base with her, just say, I understand you live next to one of these. And I asked her, I went over the other day, and I literally asked her this question for a specific reason. And I said, how do you feel about the Airbnbs? Because I didn't want to come here and misrepresent what she said. She said, I hate them. All right. So I encourage you, like I said, to just touch base and say, hey, Chris came over and talked to us, and I understand you live by one, and see if she wants to tell a story or two. I did, just for this meeting, go over Saturday night and Sunday night. Maybe it was Friday night and Saturday night. So on the property that Sarah lives next to, there were 10 cars Friday night and 8 cars Saturday night at one plotted piece of property. None of them live there, if you will. Another annoying thing is there's just a lot of traffic on the street, and Sarah actually brought this up, that especially the contractors drive like idiots. I mean, the thing is like an eighth of a mile long, if that. It's like, how do you even get up to 35 miles an hour? It just doesn't make sense, but it happens a lot. Another thing to consider, so I own the property right next to mine, which is a smaller home, 1,200 square feet. It's been empty for probably almost 2 years because we ripped the bathroom out and thought we were going to do this ourselves. But just to give you an idea, so I long-term rented that to 3 renters since approximately 2009. So the first renters lived there for probably 2 years and then bought a house in Oregon. He is the pastor at Hope Community Church. 3 kids, they all go to Oregon schools. The second lady was the sister of an Oregon teacher at Jerusalem. Third lady worked at Power Training. But in terms of civic, in terms of like civic design, if you will, or what you want your community to look like, the problem with these Airbnbs is they make a lot more money, right? So anytime you sell one of these, even if it's somebody in town, you're taking the opportunity away for someone else to have a place to live who's going to be a resident of this city. There's no other way to look at that. And I think about that, especially now when I see some of the home prices in my neighborhood of what are really entry level or starter homes. You know, my first house was $85,000 in Point Place, and it was a nice house. I don't I don't know how anybody could come into Oregon and just even start things with the prices of some of these homes. And interestingly enough, Joel and I had a discussion about this last week. So when he was negotiating for his house, he was outbid by someone trying to turn it into an Airbnb. And the lady who owned it was wise enough and savvy enough and didn't want that to happen, that she sold it to Joe. So think about that in terms of what it does to the community. So I will be honest, if I lived in Sarah's house, I would move out. I would not, I couldn't stand that. Maybe I'd put a 6-foot fence up for a while and see if I could stand it. But it pretty much drives me crazy because they get 4 or 5 contractor trucks, especially when they were doing all the tornado repair. So in conclusion, I would say that from a resident's perspective, it's a disappointment for a lot of reasons. And a lot of times I sit there and go, how is this not a commercial property? How is something that's advertised on the internet, that is a commodity, that there's a daily rate for, how is it not a hotel? How is it not taxed as that? How is it not regulated as that? How is it not that? Right? It's awkward having different people there all the time, right? I'm a big outside kind of guy. I wash my cars out front. You know, in the springtime, the boat's in the driveway and I'm sanding it. It's just awkward. Our bathroom's next to the street. I will look out there and see people coming in at 2, 3 in the morning. Who is it? I don't want to be the street police. I don't want to be the guy who calls about something that looks weird, but there's really no reason to be calling the police. And then there's a density question, right? Like how much of this is going to happen? When does this stop? So does my whole street turn into an Airbnb? Because at this point, we're one house away from my direct neighbors, Airbnb. Bailey has lived there for 30 or 40 years. Airbnb, garage is an Airbnb. That's my street. So those are my big points, I guess. It changes the complexity of the street. It's at least awkward, if not a little unnerving at times, especially as the popularity of carrying guns around and being allowed to carry guns around and all of that happens. And I'm coming home at night. My kids are coming home at night. My son comes home from hockey practice at 11, 12 o'clock at night sometimes. What do you want your community to look like in the end? Like when does this stop? Or can you stop it? And that's about it. I'll leave you with this. So just in the last 3 months, I have a neighbor named Patty whose husband has prostate cancer. I brought her cookies. I brought her pies. I just go over and say hi. Airbnb doesn't do that. No neighbor does that. Doug Kuzno, who's a firefighter for you guys, is building a garage. My neighbor brought his John Deere with a bucket over, helped him get the lumber on the roof. Airbnb doesn't do that. So thanks for listening. I really appreciate all of the support and the calls this week to encourage me to come in.
Thank you, Mr. Belli. We certainly appreciate you coming in and sharing your concerns and your experiences with what you're seeing in the neighborhood. I'll open it up to council members if there's any questions or thoughts at this point in time before I add any of my own.
Thank you, Mr. Hornick.
Mr. Wallenczak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Belli, I know you and I had a conversation earlier this week, And as I talked to you before the meeting, I went and talked to our legal counsel to see what we can do. What legal mechanism does the city have? Our hands are tied to a certain degree, but I did ask Melissa to look at what we can do to help alleviate some of your issues and start trying to make a resolution to some of the concerns that you do have.
Yeah, I understand. My opinion of that is I'm not a city council member or a mayor, but it just decides on how much you want to fight it. Because, so I was in Colorado this summer, in a very expensive town, and I started a conversation with a waiter, just, hey man, how do you even live here? And he brought up the fact that their town had put a moratorium on Airbnbs because they have a housing crisis. They're like, we can't have people buying these things and turning them into hotels. You know, if you want to have a hotel, just have a hotel. There's a like property for sale on Navarre Avenue. You know, if you want to make a three-room motel, make a three-room motel. I'm like fine with it. But my guess is that you guys don't want that happening with somebody not attending it, which is another thing that happens. Like, where is the accountability for this? Who am I accountable for? Do I call the police? Because it sure seems to me like they got better things to do than that.
Yeah, and like I said,
Yeah.
I don't know the answer, and that's why I turned to her and I spitballed some stuff to her. She hopefully will find out better things that I thought of in our
100%.
conversation. But there's a starting point that we can start trying to build back what your neighborhood was.
And my purpose wasn't to come here and get into a rant about it, but obviously I wanted to just present a picture and present some thoughts, but I don't want them there and I don't want to deal with them. So,
Understand?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ray. Thank you, Mr. Wallenzak. Any other members with anything to add?
Mr. President,
Mr. Reeves?
thank you. I don't have anything to add as of right now, but I would like to hear from our administration what can be done, what we can, how to rectify the situation. And if there is anything, I know that I have asked our clerk of council to get some property maintenance things, you know, for our, nothing upsets me more than when I drive around and see all kinds of vehicles parked where they shouldn't be. And we should be able to limit the number of cars that are parked on that street if that is not, I'm not sure if that area is, do we maintain the streets there or do they maintain their, I know there
It's our
was,
street.
there are a couple that are maintained by the citizens, correct? Like Bonnie Doon or something like that,
Yeah.
or one of those areas. Well, if we are maintaining those streets and we are in charge of maintaining those streets, then we should be able to put signs up or something. I know signs don't stop people. It might deter somebody from parking where they shouldn't, but if there's only room for 2 or 3 cars to park in like a driveway, that's all the vehicles that you should be able to have there. They'll have to park someplace else and walk. And if we see that, we should be allowed to ticket that. It's-
I don't wanna-
No, go ahead.
I don't want to over.
Christopher, I'm gonna tell you, I'd be hotter than you if I lived in that area.
I'm just trying to be professional.
Well, I tried for about 2.5 years for a person that lived next to me. And finally, you know, it got to the point where it was either move, which I ended up doing, or something else that wouldn't have been polite.
I don't want to over exaggerate the parking problem.
But we have a code where people are not allowed to park in their front yards. And if they're parking in grass, that, I know right now, I think there's a 30-day waiting, I mean, yeah, they have 30 days to remove it. That's why I've asked our clerk of council to get this. I want to meet with, Mr. Major and our, uh, building and zoning director, and we need to rectify something, and get it where it's, if they're not, if they're parked in people's yards, that cannot happen. If it's parked on grass in the front yard, it cannot happen. That we need to, take care of that situation, whether it's, citing them or, whatnot. But, I'd like to hear from the administration if we could.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. And before I hand it over, just a few things as we've talked about just briefly in the hallway, and I know we've spoken internally some things with this. You know, can we restrict parking from the street? Can we use signage for that? Is there a registration piece that Airbnbs have to register with the city so we know where they are, who's operating them, kind of what the intent of that particular property is? And I guess then just a general question, what else can we as a city do that would help improve what we see in these neighborhoods if we can't in fact do anything about them? So I would turn that question to the administration, Mr. Mazur or Mayor. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Chris, I can sympathize with you. I think all of us basically can here. Years ago, Airbnbs or bread and breakfast or whatever type arrangements, whatever they wanted to call it, were actually permitted by the city. They come in to get permits. But, and I can't remember exact years ago, what must have been maybe 7, 8 years ago. It was, I believe, that's when the federal government ended up overruling that. And so they do not come into us for a permit or to be allowed to have an Airbnb. They just are allowed to. So they don't have to come here anymore. It's not something we sanction, have any part of. They don't have to even let us know, which most of them don't. I'm guessing there's over 100 Airbnbs of some sort within the city limits, if not more. When I went checking around, like you found quite a few in just your area. You can imagine for the whole city, once they found out you could make profit fairly easily with it, it was on. And it was a matter of numbers. Pay so much for house and they can get a bigger return, and they do it. So Melissa, our law director, and I've talked quite a bit about this, especially since you brought it up, and even prior to that. We've actually issued some permits for an Airbnb after the federal government had intervened. And people say, well, why would you give them a permit? I go, well, if we did, we actually put regulations on it and we could get them to abide by it. But when they didn't get a permit process to us, we couldn't. We can regulate what happens on that road. It's a non-curbed road, so parking, it has to have a stone area for them or something to park on if they were to. So there's things we can do, and to try to make some regulations to make it, and it does make sense. If you were going to have an Airbnb, you should have parking for the amount of people that you choose to take in there. So those are things we'll look at. And when you brought up that there were communities that put a moratorium on, that's great for the term of the moratorium, but moratoriums are short-lived. I think the maximum you can have them is 180 days. So you can use that to buy time to create your regulations, and then you hope that you put regulations in order that if they're challenged, they'll hold up. And that's what we're looking at now. Other communities around us have put some regulations in place, fairly stringent ones. They may or may not hold up to a challenge. So we're trying to come up with something that we can put in place that, if challenged, we can still stand our ground. And I know it's tough to make, when I say owners of this, irresponsible people responsible. We haven't found a way to do that. And There's no magic wand that we have that can create that. But so what we want to do is create regulations without putting up boundaries on people that are responsible. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, and we got to carefully pursue that, because in the collateral, we want to try to create little, if any, collateral damage in putting up those regulations.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mazer?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. Thank you, Mr. President. Back to Mr. Reeves' question. It does take a time to research these things. As we've checked some of the area codes already, some of the neighbor communities, a lot of them don't have any codes on the Airbnbs. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but try to get some ideas, make sure we're catching everything, we're not missing something that we're not seeing right now. And of course, legally, if we can, what we're able to do, what we're not able to do, and see what has already been challenged, and make sure we don't fall into any of those traps too, so we're not infringing on people's rights. And so it's going to take a little research, and we can always bring something back when the time is ready, when everybody's comfortable with the amount of research, and come up with something that would be suitable for what the needs are here. Does that help?
Yes. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Mazer. Council, and yes, Mr. Belli.
How is this not commercial? Like, how is it different than a hotel at that?
Mr. Belli and Mayor Algoji, I stood in that audience no less than probably 10 or 11 years ago and asked that question about a group home that's in my neighborhood, of how is this not a commercial entity? I'm going to turn it over because I think this is the man that answered me at that time. So I'm going to kind of go back to the mayor on that one, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Chris, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Chris, or I call you just because I want to be more personal. And we thought we had that ability to do, like I said, the federal government came in and said, any group that's working as a family, and they redefined family, and all they had to do is be living in the same household, or in that arrangement where they were working on a common goal. So just as you said, you could rent your house for long term, they're saying, well, they could do it for short term. It was no different other than the time parameters, and they come up with a whole new definition that just created living could be just for one day. And so it undid every strength we had to try to put regulations up. So now when we're going to regulate, and you're right, I mean, when they're paying money to rent, it is a business. But if you're renting a house for 3-year lease, that's a business too. And they couldn't stop that. They allowed that, and they just determined that one day wasn't any different in their definition than was 3 years. So when we are going to create regulations, we can create regulations around the home, maybe not within it, but parking is a good one. And on your street, being a non-curbed road, as far as I know, parking isn't permitted on a non-curbed road unless you have a sort of paved area to park on. And then we can even regulate that, or put a no parking signs on the road. We got to be careful with your own neighbors then, because they may say, well, we have some people over sometime and we're not park on it. So that collateral damage kind of falls into place. So we don't want to hurt you in the attempt to help you. So it's not all that easy, but we'll try. And just like in Steve's case,
him and the neighbors made great points, but we have only so much power and then we start violating people's rights. So we, once again, we don't have the magic wand. So we gotta be clever. And
Thank you.
I say intuitive or whatever, we have to, oh, innovative is the word.
Do you have any authority for them to report how many times a year it's rented,
No,
like, or anything like
no.
that? Like,
no, and that's the little strengths we had dissolved. So like I said, now we have to be innovative in how we protect the property around it. And
Yeah, the Federal Housing Authority, a lot of those things started to change 8, 10 years ago. You know, just trying to create access and opportunities for people to own homes, be in long-term residence, things of that nature. As cities, it did remove some of the tools that we may have had. And I think from a city standpoint, our opportunity and our desire is to try to help elevate the experience in the neighborhood for you and the residents that are there and try to limit or impede what we can of some of the concerning or disturbing behavior, parking, loudness, things of that nature, because this is a residential community and there are people that are still living in their houses, not just renting their houses. And we want to make sure we address that. So, Mr. Bella, on behalf of the council and the city and the administration, thank you for coming out. It takes a lot to stand up and say, I've got something I'd like someone to look at. So we really appreciate you coming out to do that and know that, you know, we'll move this ball down the field a little bit when we have something that makes sense. We'll make sure that we're engaging with you so you're kind of hearing where we're at and what we think we can do with this. And we'll certainly keep you plugged in as we kind of move down on this. All right.
Good.
Thank you very much,
You
Mr.
bet.
Bella.
I gotta run.
All righty. You're gonna miss all the excitement.
I know.
We appreciate it again. Thank you. Have a great night. Stay warm out there.
Take care.
Okay. Council, we'll move into our agenda for this evening. We have 4 items to be considered in the committee of the whole. I will start with the first one, which is item 3 of 2024, presented by Mayor Michael Safarian and Service Director Paul Roman. I believe we're going straight to Mr. Roman on this.
Thank you, Mr. President. This ordinance is needed to purchase a facility maintenance tractor for the street department. This tractor will be used mainly for snow and ice removal, but can be used for other general maintenance. There is a brushing attachment and seating attachment and so on. The purchase itself is through the state purchasing program, and a full description and cost are included in Exhibit A. The purchase was included in the 2024 budget under the street department. So, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roman. Council, any questions for Mr. Roman or the administration on item 3?
Mr. President,
Mr. Reeves?
thank you. Mr. Roman, would this be used for something like Navarre Avenue for the sidewalks and things like that?
It would be, yes, and mainly overpasses, and things like that really fall on the city to maintain. So it can be used for very small or narrow sidewalks is clearly what it's for.
Okay, I'm just, what is, maybe I didn't see it, but I'm trying to find out. It looks like it's got several different attachments to it.
Yes.
What is the size of the blade compared to like what we would use on our sidewalk? I
Yeah.
know that I don't want to bash another entity in our city, but sometimes they use a truck to plow it and it tears up the grass.
Yeah, this plow is a 42-inch wide,
Is that, and what's,
42.
what is
Most-
usually the width of a sidewalk?
Normally 4 foot, 48.
48?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you, Mr. Roman. Council, any other questions, comments on item 3? Hearing none, I'll seek a motion to move item 3 of 2024 to next week's agenda.
Mr. President,
Mr. Wallenzeck.
thank you, Mr. President. Make motion to move item number 3 of 2024 to next week's regular meeting agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Wallenzeck.
Second.
Second by Mr. Reeves. Council, any objections to moving item 3 of 2024 to next week's agenda? Hearing none, item 3 is moved to next week's agenda. Next item on our agenda for this evening is item number 4 of 2024, again presented by Mayor Mike Safarian and Public Services Director Paul Roman, and we'll go straight to Paul on this one.
Thank you, Mr. President. This ordinance is needed to purchase a specialized polymer for the wastewater treatment plant in order to dewater sludge. We've had this purchase order ordinance a couple years in a row now. This particular polymer is made by Paladine. They are the sole supplier and vendor of the product. We normally use close to $50,000 to $60,000 worth of this product. So because of that, we do need the ordinance to cover the purchase. There is no increase in price from last year's cost, but again, we needed the ordinance for the purchase. So, but again, and then this is also included in the 2024 budget as well.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Roman. Council, any questions on item 4? Hearing none, I'll seek a motion to move item 4 of 2024 to next week's agenda.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to move item 4 to next week's agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Salander.
Second.
Second by Mr. Reeves. Council, is there any objections with moving item 4 of 2024 to next week's agenda? Hearing none, item 4 is moved to next week's agenda. Next item for tonight is item 5 of 2024, and again, we'll go to Mr. Roman.
Thank you, Mr. President. This ordinance is needed to sign change order number 1 with Kirk Brothers for the wastewater treatment plant safety disinfection dirt removal improvement project. This first change order is really a list of items that we've agreed on. We still have several items that we're still arguing over and negotiating on. The change order itself, we did include this cost in the 2024 budget. And we will have another change order and hopefully just one more to close out the project. But most of the items on this in Exhibit A were unforeseen items. There were some betterments, a lot of it with the digesters. We just saw areas that needed improvement once you removed a lot of the sludge and so on. Probably the biggest item number 6, there was a discrepancy in the drawings on the size of the diameter of a final settling tank. And as much as there was an error in the drawings, contractors are still required to field verify before they order supplies, in particular concrete and railing. That's something the contractor did not do. Originally, when they asked for this claim, it was like $98,000. We later then argued that they should have field verified, and there are certain things that we weren't going to cover. In the end, we ended up just paying for the materials that would have been in the original bid, and we came to a negotiated price of, and that was the $47,000. That really was the biggest item, and probably the last. The project, as you guys recall, we had a delay in this project. There was a transformer that we couldn't get for a full year. We're still waiting for that transformer. It still has yet to be built, and we have one thing we told Kirk Brothers that we would officially extend the project. A lot of times they don't like to do that right away because they like to see that they're producing and getting things done. They are, and we have come to an agreement to extend the project completion to August 1st, and that does work with funding the project. One other good thing about this project is we did receive a very large grant from the Department of Development, which was $4.2 million towards this project, which is good. But again, we still have other change order items, and I don't think altogether it'll be well below what we put in the 24 budget to cover, as well as our certainly way below what we had as contingencies for this project. So, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roman. Council, any questions on item 5 from Mr. Roman or the administration? Hearing none, I'll seek a motion to move item 5 of 2024 to next week's agenda.
Mr. President.
Mr. Wallenzeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make a motion to move item number 5 of 2024 to next week's regular meeting agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Wallenzeck.
Second.
Second by Mr. Reeves. Council, are there any objections to item 5 on next week's agenda? Hearing none, item 5 is moved to next week's agenda. Last item on our agenda for consideration this evening is item 6 of 2024, and we're leaving all the heavy lifting to Mr. Roman, so we'll go there again.
Thank you, Mr. President. This ordinance is needed just to assign an amendment with our original agreement with Evergreen Landfill. I don't know, I know in at the time we talked about the water rates, we talked about this a little bit, but we do have an agreement with Evergreen in which I view it as a barter exchange. We treat their leachate at no cost, and they landfill our dried sludge at no cost to us. And so it's worked out to be a great deal. The original contract was for 5 years and then to be renewed automatically on an annual basis. In theory, we don't have to do this amendment at all. We can just do the annual renewal every year. But we did meet in December, and they had asked, gee, could we just go another 5 years without the automatic renewal? Financially, it's more secure. And I said I didn't have a problem with it because I know it's a savings to us for operating clearly by doing what we did. So I had no problem with it. So so the only thing we're changing from the original agreement is just extending the 5 years. I think it'll go to December 31st of 2028. Instead, what we had in there is 23. So everything else remains the same in the agreement. So that's it.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Roman. Council, any questions or comments for Mr. Roman or the administration on item 6 of 2024?
Mr. President.
Mr. Wallensack.
Mr. President, before I make a motion to move this forward, I would like to thank Mr. Roman on this. If members of council remember, we used to do land application of our sludge coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. I think this is a far better option of doing dewatering and putting it into the landfill to prevent that from going out on our fields, in our backyards. So I would like to commend the administration for making that change a few years back. And if there's no questions from the rest of the council, I will make a motion to move this forward.
Thank you, Mr. Wallensack.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Reeves to move item 6 of 2024 to next week's agenda. Council, any objections? Hearing none, item 6 of 2024 is moved to next week's agenda. That concludes the agenda items we had this evening. We will move on to the mayor's report.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Mazer?
No report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Mazer. Ms. Purpura?
No report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Purpura. Mr. Roman?
I just wanted to give a heads up that we are working on 2 other ordinances. One was a vehicle purchase for distribution department. The other one was a survey equipment purchase for public service. But our hope is to get it done this week and put it on the agenda for next week. That's all.
Okay, both budgeted items.
Yes, yes, they are.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Roman.
Yep.
Mr. Reeves?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a reminder of our Parks and Recreation and Parks meeting on next Monday at 6 o'clock in council chambers back here. Unless it's too big, then we can move it out here for the update or what we're gonna do with pickleball and Boom Fest. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Mr. Wallensack?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Wallensack. Ms. Ackerman?
Okay, sorry about that. I don't have a report from my committee, but I did have a question about the master plan. I know you talked about it, Mr. Major, and I've been reviewing it, and I was wondering if we would have an opportunity to review it as a body before we spend to go and create a new one.
Thank you, Ms. Ackerman. Mr. Mazer?
Thank you, Mr. President, Ms. Ackerman. The RFQs have already been advertised. We've received 4, and the scoring team is reviewing them now. We're actually meeting this week on Thursday. And once we review them, we'll have a recommendation to enter into a contract with, as long as we find one, we have one that we accept, one of the RFQs, but we'll have a contract prepared and seek council approval for a contract to start the master planning process. So this will be for a updated master plan, which is close to 20 years old now.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was.
I mean, you said review it in front of.
Right. Well, no,
So-
well, I'm just as I'm going through, because I'm playing catch up, you realize, I mean, I read this over 2 years ago, but I know it says that it can be amended, it needs to be reviewed. Do you know if any amendments have ever been made to? I know you weren't here for this whole time, so maybe some of the older members know? Or
I don't
may-
believe so. I don't
Okay.
believe there's been any amendments or any
Okay, I just
changes.
wanted to know if I had the whole thing or I was, if there was an amendment I wasn't aware of. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ackerman. Thank you, Mr. Mazur. I don't believe there have been any amendments, and I would believe through kind of process, when we get to that point of, announcing or assigning with somebody for the update of the master plan, that we would probably call a committee hearing or a committee meeting of the Economic Development Committee, talk through what in the plan today exists and what our priorities are as a community. Would be somewhere in that process right at the onset as we start to develop into the new one. So there would, at some point in time, be a committee meeting to speak to the existing and then the goals and hopes into the new one
Okay, thank
from
you.
us. Thank you, Ms. Ackerman. Mr. Salander.
No report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Salander. Mr. Drake.
No report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Drake. And I don't have anything from my standing committee. I do want to ask one thing, and I'm putting her on the spot for Ms. Rawson. In looking at our calendar online today, is it possible for us to update our meeting calendar that's available online to include committee meetings, any of the zoning meetings, any of the things that come up that get scheduled or have some regular cadence to them? Can we add and update those things into the city calendar so that residents can go on there and see that?
I'm sure we can, yeah. Thanks, Mr. President. I'm sure we can. I'm sure I can get with the website consultant that we work with and have them just add that to the community calendar. That way the citizens can know what's going on. So we can do that.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Rawson. I appreciate it. With that, I will seek a motion to adjourn.
Mr. President,
Mr. Reeves,
so moved.
moved by Mr. Reeves,
Second?
second by Mr. Salander. Council, any objections? Hearing none, meeting is adjourned.